really one of the greatest translators around, Dr. Esther Allen with us. She's, of course, translated, edited, and annotated the selected writings of José Martí that all of you have in your possession, which was named a notable book in 2002 by the Los Angeles Times Book Review and selected by The Guardian in 2015 as one of the 10 best books for understanding Cuba. She is a professor in the doctoral programs in French and in Latin American, Iberian, and Latino cultures at the City University of New York Graduate Center and in the Modern Languages Department at Baruch College, CUNY. And she is currently writing a new biography of the man of the hour, José Martí. So I'm sure she's full of all kinds of juicy anecdotes about our apostle. And that's going to be published by Henry Holt and Company. So really, it's a great pleasure to have Esther Allen with us.
Thank you so much, James. And it's a huge pleasure to be here. I actually owe so much to NEH seminars about José Martí, because the last one was in 2002. It was here in Tampa. It's where I met James. It's where I met Anita. And in that period of my life, I was one of these people who had gotten a doctorate and couldn't get a job. So I had been on the job market for 9 years. May have never happened to any of the people in this room. And I kind of felt like I just wasn't going to become an academic. And the invitation to that NEH seminar really made me feel reintegrated into academia. It did so much for me. It gave me so much. And I am eternally grateful to Anita and Mike Conniff, who were the 2 people who invited me. And I'm in a better situation now, I'm happy to say. But I'm just every bit as grateful to James for the invitation, and I'm so delighted to see you all here. I noticed in the program that my talk has an exclamation mark at the end of it. And that wasn't in the program. And in fact, most of my talk, I'm not really going to tell you juicy anecdotes about Martí or fill you in on aspects of the life that you might not have known about. I'm dealing more here with a sort of existential issue that is at the very heart of the act of writing a biography about him in English. That my proposal to myself in the biography and to the publisher was to integrate him into the history of the United States, to sort of fill in that desencuentro. That's a word that Julio Ramos uses that I'm going to be talking about in a moment. And I cannot do that without concern, without fear. I'm very happy to see that José Martí himself is right here in this talk. Very happy. I wasn't quite expecting that. I signed up for this talk. But fear and concern of what happens when you integrate something into a new context, when you make those connections. And it's a natural fear and concern for me as a translator, because that's actually what you do as a translator. You take something from out of one context and you put it into another context, and thereby transform it, change it. Things take their meaning from their context, and that's something that's true of works of literature. It's true of works of art, right? And so how does the meaning change, and what are the potential pitfalls, right? So I come to you very, very seriously with this very serious question. What does it mean to take seriously the idea of integrating José Martí into U.S. history, into somehow saying José Martí is a writer who belongs, who deserves to be studied with the literature of the United States, who deserves to be studied within the history of the United States? What are the positives and the negatives that come into play when you ask this question? And so I want to put my whole talk, all of you know the Cuban artist Tania Bruguera. Have you ever heard of her? She's heads nodding other people. So Tania is an amazing force of nature. She actually announced her candidacy for the presidency of Cuba in 2016. That didn't go very far. But she is known all over the world. She collaborates with the Tate, with the Museum of Modern Art. She's an extraordinary artist. And she just had a residency of 2 years at the Park Avenue Armory, which I love because the Armory is from the 1880s. It's this incredible building on the Upper East Side from the 1880s. So it's a completely José Martí context. So that I can easily imagine that Martí, just as you can imagine him wandering around the Plant Museum, you can totally imagine him wandering around the Armory because it was a place where New Yorkers gathered and that's where he went. So Tanya just had this 2-year residency, and at the end of the residency, she had a salon one Sunday, and for her salon, she took white drop cloths and she put them over the portraits of 19th century military men that hang along the hallway. It's a military installation, the Armory, and it still retains that quality even though it's been transformed into an art museum. So she has these white drop cloths, and on them she put phrases, and they were phrases that she had developed with local public high school students that work with the Armory. They're called the Armory Youth Corps. And one of them I thought was very relevant for our discussion today. Very relevant for high school students, right? You can easily imagine a group of high school students gripping this phrase, but also very relevant for thinking about Martí in the way that I'm inviting you to think about Martí. What does it mean to belong? What does it mean to say that Martí belongs to U.S. history, that he belongs to the history of U.S. literature? What does that, and does anything belong to anything? Isn't belonging a bad thing? Isn't that what, belonging is a concept that comes up when we talk about slavery and things like that, right? So how perilous is it to even ask the question about belonging and do we want to belong? All kinds of strange things come up. And I couldn't help noticing that Tanya, because she's a really great artist, hung this particular banner right next to the exit. So I have to imagine that that was a deliberate choice on her part. Here's another way of asking the question. And basically throughout my talk today, I'm going to be asking this question. And then I'm going to ask you guys to ask the question. Does everybody have a handout, by the way? Because you might be, if anybody doesn't have a handout, here. Did you distribute that to people who don't have it? So just to give you a little foreshadowing of what we'll be doing this afternoon, I'm going to talk you through briefly some of my concerns about, and these are concerns that begin with the book that you all have, the Selected Writings of José Martí, which has had a really, really interesting history. I mean, I can talk about that a little bit before we get into this question. When that book was first published, I introduced it at a panel at the MLA, and somebody in the audience stood up and denounced me for having translated José Martí into English, because Martí belongs to Spanish, and we need to discuss it in Spanish, and to translate him into English is a cultural co-optation, a cultural appropriation. And I was like, well, did you read what the book is about? It's all about New York City in the 19th century. And, but I was denounced for having translated Martí into English. And then, years after that, and other people didn't denounce me. That was just one reaction. But it was interesting that I confronted that reaction. And interestingly enough, that reaction was not from somebody who was Cuban. It was from somebody whose first language was English. And so then a few years after that, I get a call from West Point, the military academy. And they say that every year the junior class of West Point chooses a country, and they devote all of their studies to that country for that year. And the junior class at West Point that year, I think it was like 2011, 2012, had chosen Cuba. So they were ordering 600 copies of my book, The Selected Writings of José Martí. And of course, when I told my Cuban friends about that, my Cuban friends said they're going to invade. They're definitely preparing an invasion. And your book is going to serve as a blueprint for invasion. So, I mean, these are the kinds of things that have come up in the history of that other book, right? And now as I think about this new book, and the case that I think I'm trying to make in the book, although I'm not quite sure, I wonder, what purposes what can happen, when something is out there in the world, what uses does it get put to? So these are a list of writers more or less considered U.S. writers. 4 of them are actually in the Library of America, right, which is the high prestige collection of American literature. One of them, Adriaen van der Donck, might be one of the ones who's most like Martí because he was a Dutch colonist who wrote an extraordinary document about the island of Manhattan when it was New Amsterdam. And that document was largely ignored until a man named Russell Shorto wrote a history of New York called The Island in the Middle of the World. And years after that book came out, that Dutch document was finally published in English for the first time in like 2007. So Adriaen van der Donck is somebody who's formative in the history of New York, who writes really important description of New York at a certain point in its history that because it's not in English, gets ignored for centuries, right? So I see that as being quite similar to Martí, but he's now being more recognized. Most students of American literature will recognize Crèvecoeur. Anybody will recognize Alexis de Tocqueville, who in some way is the least American of all of these writers. He only spent 9 months in the United States, but his work about the United States became so fully integrated into the nation's sense of itself that he is taught in American history courses, American studies, American literature. He's absolutely integrated into the curriculum in that way. And it's really interesting because his position vis-a-vis the United States is, I think, very similar to Martí's. He's a foreigner, he's an outsider, he's commenting on what he sees and experiences, but he's also trying to draw conclusions about the system of government, about the social organization, more general conclusions. He does so somewhat more concisely than Martí, in 2 brief volumes, whereas Martí is sprawled out over all these chronicas, but very much the same kind of view of a foreign country. The United States as someone writing, except of course Martí knew the United States so much better than Tocqueville did because he lived here for 15 years and Tocqueville was only here for 9 months. I often think, what if Martí had been translated right away, the way Tocqueville was, and his views of the United States had been integrated into the history of the United States, into the way that the United States saw itself? How much would that have changed? How much could have been different if that had happened? But of course, there was no way because Tocqueville was a European, so he had the prestige vista, right, of the European point of view, whereas Martí was a Latin American in a period when the United States barely acknowledged the existence of such a thing. There had been maybe, at that point, like 2 books translated from Latin American Spanish, one of which was by Sarmiento, right, which is the first Latin American book translated into English. So very similar position to Martí's, but because he has this prestige, doesn't get integrated. Nabokov, of course, I don't know, do you learn about Nabokov in an American literature class? Maybe, maybe not. Sort of belongs to two cultures at the same time. I.B. Singer, Alfau, how many of you have heard of Felipe Alfau? Such an interesting writer, can't recommend him strongly enough. Wrote in both Spanish and English. So you almost have to be bilingual to read him. Put all of his manuscripts into a drawer, never published them because he thought it would be impossible to read them. And they were only published at the very end of his life and circulated, and one of them was nominated for a National Book Award. He's an absolutely fascinating New York City figure, so very much like Martí. Again, Eileen Chang, U.S. citizen, unlike Martí, but wrote in Chinese. Jack Kerouac, nobody knows, but Jack Kerouac was French-Canadian, and his first language was French, and he wrote in French. But then he switched to English. Only now is American studies starting to take into account the fact that Jack Kerouac wrote in French and considered himself French-Canadian. Yeah, we never heard about this when we studied the Beats, right? And then finally, and probably most pertinently, Julia de Burgos, who I think is very much acknowledged in New York City. Specifically, there's a street named after her. There's a cultural center named after her. She is, of course, the Puerto Rican poet who actually ended her life homeless on the streets of New York City and wrote in both Spanish and English. But my question is, would Julia de Burgos end up in a say, the Norton Anthology of American Literature, which in fact does not include Julia de Burgos, but one of the very few Hispanics to appear there is none other than José Martí, whose Nuestra America, Our America, is in the Norton Anthology of American Literature, right? So interesting, and perhaps a little bit disturbing, and we'll get to that later. So, are these U.S. writers? Are they integrated? Should they be? This is a question that I put out to you. So one of the reasons for my choosing this particular image of Martí by Guillaume de Pavón that we began the text with is this is actually not a piece of paper that's been crumpled up. Guillaume just draws Martí with all the seams and all the wrinkles as if it was an image of Martí that had been crumpled up. And I think we can all intuitively feel why Guillaume would choose to do that. Why would you say that Guillaume would choose? He, by the way, is a Cuban artist who lives in New York City. Why would he choose to represent Martí in this strange, crumpled, handled, fingered way?
He's been discarded.
Oh, so Martí has been thrown away, like discarded.
I think it shows facets, multifacets.
Multifacets. It's kind of
So it's like asymmetrical and sort of unclear as to what directions it should be going or something like that.
He's been handled so much that the picture has changed. The myth of the having been touched is more.
It's like the roce, right? That Spanish word roce, like the friction, the handling, right? Martí has been, he's not pure, innocent Martí. He's Martí who's passed through so many hands, right?
Yeah, it's the word that popped in my head was a Spanish word, and I couldn't think the English word. It was manoseado.
Yeah.
No? It's manoseado.
Yeah. He's been used. He's been used, right? And this is the thing that we know about Martí more than any other, is that Martí, more than anybody else, gets used. Used by every side.
Yeah, I guess to follow what James said, earlier James mentioned that the word útil, so he's been útil.
He's been used, and he's been useful to a lot of people, right? And meanwhile, he's starting to get a little bit tattered, right? You can't see him so well anymore because he's been so manoseado that the image is starting to fade, it's starting to blur. So now I just want to run through, and I know this is all very familiar to all of you guys. I just want to run through a few of the ways in which, I've noted Martí being used in recent travels and collections. This is a poster that I found in Havana in 2017. Obviously, it is Martí transformed into Fidel, right? Very famous photograph of Fidel, with a line of poetry by Martí. Fidel, of course, is far from being the first Cuban leader to co-opt Martí. In fact, every Cuban leader has co-opted Martí, either in the United States or in Cuba. Like, basically, the condition of being a Cuban leader is to co-opt Martí, right? Which is why you have people like Aponte who's saying we must just forget Martí, right? So this is one instance of a use to which Martí is put. This is another, Cayocho. And again, I show this because you understand why I put that question mark. A U.S. writer, like, are people going to see that, that me introducing Martí into the context of the United States and think this? Think that this is what I mean? Think this is what I'm saying? Which would be, to me, very disturbing, because this is not what I'm saying. But how do you prevent that particular use from being made of something, right?
Where does this image, where did you find that image?
In a shop on Calle
Really?
Ocho. They're
Wow.
selling them. You could buy it, like, they were selling them like hotcakes.
Oh,
That was 2 years ago. I'm sure they're still selling them. And then this I found in Now, I want to point out that this was in no no way manufactured by the Apple Computer Company. If it had been, I would hate it. I actually have a kind of affection for it because I think if I can understand the iconography of it, I think that Apple logo for Cubans at that moment, I don't know what it represents now, but at that moment, it represented the future. It represented the internet. It represented technology. It represented connectivity. And it was a way, I saw in this a way of taking Martí out of all of the old connections and putting him in a new space, a rethinking. If Apple Computer had made this, I would hate it. I would deplore it, but it was made by a Cuban street artist. And I think, therefore, as you know, our meaning comes from context, right? So I read this, and it was funny, after this, after I bought this, my friend Pedro Pablo Rodriguez, who's the head of the Centro de Estudios Martianos, invited me to appear with him on Radio Rebelde. So I went to Radio Rebelde, and I was invited to read something by Martí. So I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about the obsession with technology that many younger people that I had met in Cuba, and I'm sure everyone's nodding their heads, yes, absolutely. I mean, it's not just younger people in Cuba, obviously. And so I had found this funny, you can find it actually in the volume. Martí too had his obsession with technology. He thought technology was going to solve problems. And I had found this funny text by him called the glossograph, which was literally, somebody had patented. It's basically what we know as voice recognition software. But in the 1880s, it was like a thing that fit into your mouth. Like, I can barely even conceive of it. He describes it quite clearly. And the idea was that it would sort of type your words as you spoke them, because it would, obviously, it can't possibly have worked. He actually didn't try it. He had just read about it. But Dr. Torrente, right, the guy who just like would talk and be carried off and transported by his own words, loved the idea of a machine that would just transcribe everything that he said, right? So that was the text that I read on Radio Rebelde. And as a result, I'm not quite as shocked and horrified by this image as you are. But again, we have to consider the context and the source before we decide what it means. So these are some of the ways in which Martí gets manoseados, right? Just a tiny, tiny sample. Let me see. So what I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this notion of desencuentro, and that Julio Ramos makes so central to his absolute seminal book about Martí. And I love the word because you can't really say it in English, even as the title says, a divergent modernity. That's not desencuentro, right? And it so describes exactly what happens with the absent reception of Martí in the United States. It was just this like, the two do not meet. It doesn't come together. It doesn't. But I'm interested that it also means desacuerdo, right? So not only do we have this encuentro fallido, but we also have this incredible desacuerdo about what Martí might mean, those two meanings. And it makes me think that, for some reason, it led me to remembering trincheras de ideas son más fuertes que trincheras de piedra. Because I actually feel like there's a negative. This might sound like a positive. Martí might seem to be saying the pen is mightier than the sword, right? But I think in our current context, we can turn that on its head. We actually have a president who's trying to build a wall, right, to like separate out communities from each other. But maybe the source of that wall is a conceptual barrier, right? The very conceptual barrier that is leading to these desencuentros. So we're in front of a conceptual barrier, and I think part of what drives me to say, no, Martí belongs in the U.S. context, why we're all here, is we're trying to overcome that conceptual barrier. And we have to think about what overcoming it might mean. So just keep that word desencuentro in mind, because later on we're going to divide up into groups, and each of you is going to get one of the 4 sort of documents that I've assembled for you. And I want you to look at it and identify, ask certain questions of it. And one of them is to identify desencuentros. If there's something here that represents this desencuentro that Ramos identifies. and that I'll be talking about as well. So I want to talk about several instances of these desencuentros, that are personal and then on a larger scale, to show why, despite all the risks associated, I do want to introduce José Martí into the history of the United States and the literature of the United States. This is the grandmother of a student of mine. His name is Kevin Cleary, so you wouldn't necessarily assume that he was Cuban or Hispanic. But this is his grandmother, and her name is Mrs. Olson. So that was what she was known in the community, but she grew up in Havana, she's Cuban, and she married a Norwegian sailor. So she became known as Mrs. Olson. And she ended up raising Kevin in the small town of Bearsville in upstate New York. And she wanted Kevin to continue experiencing his Cubanness. And one of the ways she would do that would be to sing Guantanamera to him, so that he would still feel Cuban even as they're in this cabin in the woods outside of Woodstock in upstate New York. So Kevin enrolls in college. He comes to my class, and we start talking about in the Hispanic history. And he tells this story about his grandmother in Bearsville. And I said, well, you know, Kevin, that song was actually written just a few miles from where your grandmother used to sing it to you. And he had no idea. And neither did his grandmother. They didn't know that the words that she was singing to him that were Cuban culture, her way of keeping Cuban culture alive, were actually written within an hour's drive of where they were living. They didn't know that. And the saddest part of the story is that, as you can see, Mrs. Olson, still very lovely and dear, was experiencing dementia towards the end of her life. So by the time Kevin went home to Bearsville to tell her that the song that she'd been singing him all these years was actually written in the Catskills, she couldn't grasp it any longer. She never really learned it. But he said, I put on the song and she danced to it, right? So I think that that's a desencuentro. That's a terrible thing. Why didn't Kevin know this? Why wasn't this taught? Why wasn't this part of the story of the place that he was growing up in that he learned? It's a missed opportunity. And of course, a more famous instance of really this same desencuentro, and oh, this is just a copy. I showed this to Kevin because he wouldn't believe me. It was so inconceivable to him. Martí is Cuban, how could this have been? So I had to find this online with the New York Louis Weissen Company, 116 Fulton Street, before he would believe me. This is where the Versos Sencillos, of course, was published, right? Having been written in the Catskills, right? So a sort of larger version of that same story was brought to light by Anita Fountain herself. In her translation of the Versos Sencillos, she went and interviewed Pete Seeger, the great American folk singer, who of course popularized Guantanamera. That's why Guantanamera is a U.S. song, because everybody knows Guantanamera, right? Even if you don't know anything about Cuba, you know Guantanamera. And he learned Guantanamera in the Catskills from Hector Anglophone, but he didn't know until Anne interviewed him in the late 1990s that the song had been written in the Catskills, right where he learned it. He had no idea. He'd been singing the song for 30 years as this Cuban song that was from this foreign country, this other place. And he himself did not know, right? So that's a major desencuentro. I bet Pete Seeger would have liked to know, would have liked to be able to say people. We think of he was interested in these kinds of historical things, would have liked to be able to say, we think of this as a Cuban song, but it was actually written in my own home state of New York, you know, not far from the Hudson River. He just never knew. So that's a desencuentro. And then finally, a much more specific desencuentro. The New York Historical Society had an exhibit for 4 years, almost 4 years, about a costume ball. Well, it was about gilded New York, so it was about New York in the 1880s, and it specifically focused on this very famous costume ball at the home of the Vanderbilt family. And they had assembled, they even had this actual dress, right? which is called electric light because it was electrified. Can you imagine? In the 1880s, this woman shows up and she's wearing a dress and you push a button and it lights up. That was like the biggest thing anyone had ever seen or imagined. So they had the actual dress. They had all of these artifacts associated with this very famous party, which was kind of the centerpiece of the whole exhibit. And what's interesting is that the New York Historical Society had recently, very recently, just 2 years before this exhibit, co-sponsored a giant exhibit with the Museo del Barrio called Nueva York, which was about Hispanic New York, and which included a whole section on Martí. Right? So it wasn't that the New York Historical Society had no way of knowing about Martí or knowing who Martí was. They had literally just 2 years earlier sponsored an exhibit, a giant exhibit that had Martí in it. But of course, their exhibit that was focused on U.S. history, and this I think is another of the kind of dangers, that we have like this sidelight history, which is Latino history, which is totally separate and unintegrated, and then we have U.S. history, which has nothing to do with Latino history, right? So we just have two parallel tracks of history running through the same places in the same times, but never the twain shall meet, right? The exhibit at the New York Historical Society about the 1880s, the Gilded Age, and this particular party never mentioned at all that Martí had covered the party, had written about it extensively, and in the same Crónica where he writes about Karl Marx and the funeral for Karl Marx. So an incredible New York City juxtaposition, an incredible moment that would have added tremendously to the interest of this exhibit. And that was desencuentro, lost in a desencuentro, right? Not there. So in some sense, Martí is necessary with this, in this context of the United States. He's needed, and he keeps getting left out, even when people have the tools to find him. Of course, my book existed. I translated that Crónica. It's there in Penguin Classics, right? But it takes, I don't know what it takes. It just keeps happening. So now, I want to change up the question a little bit. I like changing it up. It's interesting because if I translate it, that's one of the ways that the question, Martí, a U.S. writer? Is Martí a U.S. writer? If I translate it into Spanish, ¿es un escritor estadounidense? The answer is no. Absolutely not. Like, no, I just know immediately. No es un escritor estadounidense, right? So that's interesting. If I ask it another way, is José Martí an American writer? Then it gets really linguistically complicated. Because the very definition of America is in flux, and American is in flux during Martí's actual lifetime, right? In 1844, right before Martí is born, the definition would have been a native of America, originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper-colored races found here by the Europeans, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America. Interesting that the definition already talks about how this word fluctuates, how much in flux it is. Of course, the citation from George Washington that implies something about who is and is not an American, but that implication is left unstated in the definition. But by the time we get to 1890, Webster's International Dictionary, it's the same book, we get to, and especially to the citizens of the United States. The definition has been changed, and what was sort of left, floating with that citation from George Washington in 1844 becomes explicit. And at the same time, we're getting this back formation. America used to be the whole hemisphere, but then as it becomes associated more and more with the United States, we get the back formation of Pan-American. And Pan-Americanism, of course, is associated with a certain phase of U.S. foreign policy. So is José Martí a Pan-American writer? No, by no means. In fact, he covers the first Pan-American conference and warns about the dangers of Pan-Americanism, right? So again, what vocabulary term we choose and what language we speak in impacts the answer that we're going to give to this question, which becomes more and more complicated as we take it through these different vocabulary terms. And of course, there's also there's also the idea, we can think about this in terms of hypotheticals. Martí read the New York Evening Post a lot when he was in New York. It's one of the papers that he cites and draws a lot of his knowledge of the United States from. And in 1848, just a few years before he was born, we have a whole article announcing the forthcoming annexation of Cuba to the United States, practically as if it's a done deal, right? And I think it's a really, the reason I included Julia de Burgos and that list of writers at the beginning is that I think it's a really interesting sort of historical hypothetical. Let's say that this had occurred. Would José Martí, in that case, be a U.S. writer? I don't know, because it did happen to Julia de Burgos. Puerto Rico got annexed, and she was born a U.S. citizen, but is she a U.S. writer? Her status is still in doubt, right? She's read in Latino communities, she's read in Puerto Rican communities. Are people learning about her outside of those communities? Are they learning about her when they learn about Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson and Mark Twain? You know, so there was this possibility of Cuba being annexed. If it had happened at that point, Martí would not have been born in Cuba because his father wouldn't have come to Cuba. So we have to discard the whole thing, but that threat of annexation, that idea of annexation, of course remains. This is from that same book on Calle Ocho. Love that store. It still remains alive, obviously, in some people's minds, right? So if this happens, would José Martí be a U.S. writer? Right? I mean, we have to ask the question within the context of this kind of fantasy, because we are living in a world where this fantasy exists. People are making postcards.
I like how the state annexes the southern tip of Florida as well.
Miami becomes the capital of this country.
There's so many great things about this postcard. I was like, yeah, this is a classic.
It should go up to Tampa.
Like really, walk into the gift shops. I recommend walk into the gift shops. You will see stuff. You will see amazing stuff. Okay, so now here's another way of framing the question. What about in Martí's own time? How was he seen? How was he known by the U.S. public? This is kind of the question that Lisandro Perez, the wonderful Lisandro who spoke to you last week, asks and answers in his recent incredible book. He's a source. He's in the newspapers. He's a source for journalists who are covering Cuba. He's a source for, of course, he's a journalist himself. New York City is a small enough place that journalists run into each other, right? Journalists all covering the same events run into each other. People know that he is active in Cuban politics. They reach out to him. There he is in, what paper is it? USA. The Argus. Yeah. So this is in 1895. So it's not too long before he dies. But he is well enough known that newspapers stop. One of the ways you can tell if a figure is known or not known is whether or not people need to, the newspapers feel the need to identify, right? Nobody ever needs to say, Keanu Reeves, comma, an American actor, right? No. You just say Keanu Reeves and people know who it is, right? So the newspapers kind of stop death of Martí in Cuba, right? There's nothing in this article that tells you who Martí was. Everybody knows. He's at center stage. He is being reported on all the time in the papers. Anybody who reads the news knows the name, knows what's happening. There's no need to say who he was. There's a U.S. reading public that absolutely knows and is following the story. And in fact, he's such a figure in popular culture that not long after his death, you have this whole spurious story completely made up about him having a love affair with some woman. I won't even go into the details. If anybody wants, I'll send you the slide. But it's the kind of story that you tell about a famous actor, a famous villain. It's the kind of story that surfaces about people who are very famous, right? Where we're all interested in the affairs of the heart of the well-known celebrities, right? So he has achieved, in just the months after his death, such a celebrity status that there's actually money to be made peddling these spurious stories about love affairs to the popular press. As you can see, this is coming out in Ironwood, Michigan. This isn't like New York City. This is going syndicated across the country. So he is somebody that the U.S. public during this period knows. They know his name. They know who he is. Yeah.
Is that after his death? That is sort of legend.
This is after his death.
Right.
So at that moment when he dies and he's on all the headlines, then somebody decides to capitalize on it with with tales of supposed romance. So there, is he a U.S. writer? There he is in the U.S. popular press. His face is in the newspapers. His name is in the newspapers. He's known to the public. There is that connection at that moment in the 1890s and then at the moment of his death. So that's another context in which to look at our question. And then, of course, if you look at a page of Patria, I'm always fascinated when I look at copies of Patria where they actually have them in the Centro de Estudios Martiano in Havana, but I had never actually seen a copy of Patria in New York where Patria was published. It's one of these great ironies, one of these great desencuentros, right? Because Patria was published in New York. To have a copy of Patria in Havana would have been like, during Martí's lifetime, would have been like marked you out as, would have been terribly dangerous. But now, of course, these ethnic newspapers were not collected. These Spanish language newspapers, they were collected anywhere. There were Spanish language newspapers published all over the United States. And researchers who work with these materials find it very difficult to get their hands on them because nobody was archiving them, nobody was collecting them.
Yeah, I think you hit a nerve here.
Which by the way, if you don't have the archive, if you don't have the collection, then you can create this image of, all of these Latin American immigrants are coming here, and this has nothing to do with us, and this has nothing to do with our past, right? This seems to me like a sort of very deliberate desencuentro, right? If you have the archive and you have the evidence of the past and going way back. But anyway, the people at the New York Public Library are very sorry now that they don't have copies of Patria. But all the copies are at the Centro de Estudios Martianos and just a couple of other places. But the ads, I love the ads because they speak of a whole community. It's like this is a U.S. community. It's not just one person. It's this world that Lisandro so vividly brings to life in his book, and that these ads also bring to life. There are doctors, there are business people, there are manufacturers. There's the school up there, Instituto Estrada Palma de Enseñanza Primaria, and that's actually a lead. Maybe one of you will follow up on it, maybe I'll follow up on it, maybe we'll get together. But the little town where that school was located, it's called Central Valley, which is like barely even a name, right? It's just such a generic name. But the little town of Central Valley, to this day, celebrates Palma Day once a year. They have a Palma Day because they're so proud that the first president of Cuba lived in their town and was from their town. So it's like the most distinguished resident of their town. So once a year, the little library, the school children in Central Valley get together and have Palma Day, right? So that's one instance where there isn't a desencuentro, although if I actually went to Palma Day, who knows what we would find, right? But we gotta do it. With Ana Ferrer and I are always like, we're gonna get in the car and we're gonna drive up to Central Valley for Palma Day. We're gonna see what happens. We're gonna see what's going on. But anyway, this is this is a U.S. community. This is a New York City community. It's vivid, it's in depth, it has its own hotels. This is an ad for Chicago hotels, people are traveling, it's,
And excuse
so
me,
I
I
love these
don't mean
ads.
to
Every
interrupt
copy
Esther.
of Capatria has this whole page of ads.
I don't mean to interrupt, but Jonathan, notice down there, there's an ad for Atue by Francisco Sayes.
Take a picture.
I can send it to you, don't worry about it. So that's another way in which, is he a U.S. writer? We look at this and we want to say, yes, he is. This is the history of the United States. He's part of it. And some people have tried to, this is funny, this I get pushback from Anglos. So I use this among the people that I meet who are like, who's José Martí? I've never heard of him. Obviously, he's of no interest whatsoever, and he's not important because I've never heard of him, right? When you've never heard of something, it's very hard to accept that it might actually be very important, right? So MIT, the geniuses at MIT, and I showed this, James has already seen this because I showed it when we were here, did something called Pantheon, which is a database of like actual fame in term done by surveying the presence of a figure on the internet, like internationally and across languages, and then they rank people in order. And this is just writers born between 1800 and 1900, right? All over the world, okay? So that's a pretty big group of people. Writers in every country, in every language, all over the world, born between 1800 and 1900. And you can see that Martí makes number 96. He makes the top 100. So the fact that, so this is an interesting thing to talk to show to people when I'm, in the real hardcore U.S. literature community that's like, well, I've never heard of him, so he can't possibly be part of the U.S. literary history. He can't possibly have any importance. And I say, well, he's in the top 100 writers, in terms of impact, in terms of global presence now on the internet, born between 1800 and 1900 in the whole world. And in fact, he's only one of 2 Latin Americans on that list. The other one being Jorge Luis Borges, which isn't really fair because Borges was born in 1899, so he's not really in that cohort, right? But
And he's
is
not that
one
much
of
higher
the 2
either.
Latin
He's only
Americans.
83.
83, that's so weird. So that's another part of the argument. And then we come to this. And this statue has obsessed me a little bit lately because of something going on with it. But if you stand next to the statue in New York City, as I have, as I do with the Centro Cultural Cubano de Nueva York, in the freezing cold, every 28th of January, people will go by and they have no idea what you're doing there. They have no idea who the statue is. And every once in a while, you'll hear a coachman saying, "Oh, that's the guy who wrote the lyrics to Guantanamera." And I'm like, and that's why they killed him? Like, what would your understanding of this image be if that was all you knew about it?
Your words are a big deal.
So this statue is, I think, really interesting in terms of, again, this notion of context, right? Things taking their meaning from their context. This is an image of a foreign writer. How do you know it's foreign? Well, first of all, there's this tropical plant right here. There's like an agave at the foot of the horse. So this is absolutely not somebody that we are meant to think of as being in New York City. It's not somebody we are meant to think of as a New Yorker. The inscription on the side says something about how he lived in New York, but you'd have to be interested enough to read the inscription to get there. And the context of this statue is, of course, the Avenue of the Americas, which is this great Pan-American project whereby Nelson Rockefeller wanted to increase his real estate values and get Latin American countries to build expensive consulates along 6th Avenue, which until then had been a pit because there was an elevated train running along it and nobody wanted to live there. It was like a place that was noisy and dirty, right? So Nelson Rockefeller had just built Rockefeller Center. He wanted to transform the whole avenue into something really classy. So he renamed it the Avenue of the Americas. And he invited all of the Latin American countries to put up statues of their heroes. So the whole thing is lined with with Latin American, statues of Latin American military heroes, mostly military, almost all military. And so Martí is presented in that context as an outsider, a foreigner, somebody in a tropical landscape in the context of all of these Latin American leaders. And the other really interesting thing about the context of this statue is that, and I can't even tell you how many New Yorkers I have told this to, because New Yorkers literally do not see any of the statues on the Avenue of the Americas. It's as if Nelson Rockefeller's entire initiative had never existed. It's like, they say, really? First of all, I call it 6th Avenue. If anybody calls it Avenue of the Americas, they're from out of town. They don't know. You say, did you ever notice, like when you're walking along Central Park South, there are these, no, never noticed, never paid any attention. The city is just, most of the city is just blind to this. But when you start looking, it's actually really interesting because on each side of this statue are equestrian statues of Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín. And they're both generals. And they both look like generals. And they're wearing Napoleonic hats. They both have that like Napoleonic allure. And they're both triumphant. And they're on their strutting horses. So what was Nelson Rockefeller really trying to say? Because at the very top of his salute to Latin America, you have two triumphal military figures, and in the middle, this poor civilian guy who's just been killed. All right, so what's the real message there? What's the real use that's being made of this figure? And it's funny because I think it's an unconscious use. It all happened. I'm sure you guys must know this story, right? Do you know the story why that it's Martí at the moment of his death? So the woman who made the statue, Anna Hyatt Huntington, was wealthy. Like imagine Mrs. Jeff Bezos. All right, that's really the only way that you can conceive, or the ex-Mrs. Jeff Bezos. She remained married to her very wealthy spouse, and her hobby was creating giant bronze statues. And then she would give them away. And she paid for the foundry, she paid for the transportation, she loved doing this, this is what she did, and her husband took a tax write-off. And believe me, it barely even showed up in their bank accounts because that's how wealthy they were. They had a giant railway fortune. In fact, they were the consolidation of two giant railway fortunes. So she wanted the spot at the top of the Avenue of the Americas. She wanted that piece of real estate. People in New York City are all about real estate. She was all about real estate. She had a map of the city in her head where all of her different works of art were. And the top of the Avenue of the Americas on Central Park South was a spot she wanted. So she had to find some sort of Latin American military hero who she could do a statue of for that spot. And because it happened to be the early 1950s, everything was leading up to the centennial of José Martí, right? So somebody proposed Martí to her. She'd never heard of it before, but sure, fine. It would suit the purpose. But the second aspect of her work is that she was really not interested in the human figure. She liked to sculpt animals. And so it had to be an equestrian statue, because what was really interesting to her was the horse. And in fact, she's not a very good sculptor of humans. If you look at her statues, the horses are great, the animals are great, they have all this fire and energy, and the humans are kind of wooden and stilted. So everyone was like, well, Martí, like a horse? And someone was like, well, there's the moment of his death. That's really the only moment associated with horses. And she's like, well, that's great, we'll do the moment of his death, right? So that's how it happened. And actually, I went into the archive, and she had actually sent her lawyer to Cuba to sort of interview people and push forward with the project. And the lawyer came back and said, Cubans actually don't like the fact that this is going to be Martí at the moment of his death. And Cubans feel uncomfortable with that. Like, who else is portrayed sculpturally at the moment of their death? Basically, Jesus Christ. But she didn't care. She had to have her horse, and that was what mattered to her. At some point when it started getting tricky about the idea of Martí, she was like, well, find a Guatemalan hero or something. She really didn't care. She just wanted the real estate. And so that's what I think that statue means in New York. And this is Cesar Romero, who of course might or might not have been José Martí's grandchild, but there he was at the unveiling of the statue. And that's another big, long story that I'm not going to go into. But suffice it to say that the statue was supposed to be unveiled in the spring of 1959, okay? And I'll just leave that hanging. And so this is, I love this piece of work because this is a photograph by a Chilean artist named Andrés Durán. And I think that this basically sums up what New Yorkers see when they see the statue. Right? There's nothing there. There's nothing there. It has no meaning. It's blank. There's like basically a horse, and this is what people see when they go by. There's no specificity to it. There's no, it's a statue, that's it, right? So I love that. Durán is actually Chilean. He does this a lot and as you can imagine, he had a field day with the Adriaen of the Americans in New York City. But this one is particularly powerful. And then this is the same statue, which was just recently, at a cost of $3 million, replicated. It was a project by Eusebio Leal. It was replicated and placed directly in front, like on the pathway leading into the Museo de la Revolución in the former presidential palace in Havana. And the craziest thing, I was actually a little bit involved in this project from the fringes with a great deal of, but trying to think, maybe we could get a way to get more knowledge of Martí in New York out of this project, you know, maybe there's some way. And there was supposed to be a curricular initiative that went along with it. That never happened. But what was interesting about it was that the woman, the head of the Bronx Museum, who subsequently passed away, so it was kind of her final project, and it ran into all these complications. She said, "Oh, he's not at the moment of his death. He's not." I was like, "What do you mean he's not at the moment of his death? He's at the moment of his death." And there was somehow this. She's like, "Well, Eusebio Leal doesn't see the statue as being at the moment of his death." And when I talked about it with Cuban friends, they said, "Oh, Havana needs an equestrian statue of José Martí." And I said, "Well, yes, it's an equestrian statue, but he's just been shot and he's falling off the horse. It's not exactly a moment of triumph." And they looked at me. There was actually a denial that the statue actually portrays Martí at the moment of his death, which is really nuts. And the archives confirm it. There's really no doubt about it. If you look at it, it's very clear. You can see that he's falling off the horse.
Collection is chancellor. He's holding a
So, I mean, again, it's like the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears, right? But if you look at it, and it's funny because Lisandro and I have very different reaction to the statue, and I understood Lisandro's point of view when I actually saw it in Havana. And Lisandro said, "Look, I understand your objections to the project and everything, but when you actually see it, it's so beautiful, you know, against the blue sky in Havana, and it creates this connection between Havana and New York. You know, it's this sameness. But what I see is, in fact, the same tendency that we saw in that poster that says, 'Yo soy un hombre sincero.' I see Martí in the foreground and the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution, Martí leading directly, connected directly to the Cuban Revolution. Martí attached to the Cuban Revolution. Martí appropriated by Fidel Castro. And in that context, the fact that he is a civilian and he is dying is just as sinister as it is on the Avenue of the Americas in New York City. So again, when you move things from context to context, their meaning changes. And sometimes they say things that go beyond what you might have meant to say. Yeah?
I remember one of the first times I went to Cuba when they had just built the Protestodromo, you know, there on the Malecón, right? And there's this famous statue of Martí holding a baby, pointing an accusatory finger at the American intersection, right? And of course the baby's Elian Gonzalez, and Martí's protecting Elian Gonzalez, pointing at the second. Everybody that said the story, no? He's telling you where to get in line to get your visa.
Right, yeah, that's the way. People in Havana are extremely extremely good at deciphering and transforming meanings and doing that kind of thing. So I haven't yet heard like what the
So
Havana
Eusebio,
language
does
is.
Eusebio still not see this as the moment of his death? I mean, is it still like the...
No, Lisandro acknowledges at the moment of his death. It's just that
No, Eusebio, yeah.
I mean, it's very weird. If you read all of the writing that went around it, nobody addresses the fact that it portrays him at the moment of his death. Nobody does. And people looked at me like, oh, really? You see it as being at the moment of his death? I'm like, it's the moment of his death. He's got his hand on his chest. He's just been shot. Like, and it's also based on the famous painting, which shows him at the moment of his death, right? I mean, it's just, it was very funny. So I actually ran across something the other day because I just wrote something where I was talking about this disappearance of Fidel Castro that is being perpetrated both by the Cuban government, supposedly, and by an artist, a brilliant artist who recently reworked a lot of iconic photographs of the revolution and digitally removed the image of Castro. So I found something in the New York Times from 1982. I couldn't believe this. A reporter's notebook by Leslie Gell. This is 1982, and the headline is "No Iconography for Castro." And here's the first 3 paragraphs. There is something missing in Cuba. It is first sensed at Havana Airport and on the long ride into town. It is the pictures of Fidel Castro that are not on the walls, the statues of him that are not in the squares. In communist or authoritarian countries around the world, visages of the leaders stare down from everywhere. The cult of personality seems to fill the void of internal legitimacy, but not in Cuba. José Martí, the late 19th century poet and revolutionary, gets top statuary billing as the father of Cuban independence. So the Times reporter, without really knowing it, is already sensing that Martí is like the disguise assumed by Fidel Castro, that the omnipresence of Martí is a kind of disguise of Castro, and that everybody understands that to be the case.
Except that Castro, before he died, at least this is the story I've read and heard, is that he told the remaining people he did not want his name on buildings, he did not want his statue, and he did not want his picture.
They actually passed a law. The Cuban government passed a law, but then when I was in Cuba, when I was in Cuba, this was taken a month ago in Cuba. So this is the Cuban government. These are everywhere. You don't just see it. So there's Fidel, and Martí is in the middle, and the idea is these 3 are one. Fidel and Martí are one. It's that same message, but it's becoming a little bit more overt, right? You see Castro's face is there. I included these 2 images just as a reminder of what you already know, which is that these are book jackets. Every Cuban leader tries to do this. Every Cuban leader attaches their face in front of the face of José Martí. Batista did it before, every other one before that. And here's Fidel, history will absolve me, Fidel with Martí. So Martí becomes like the alibi, the disguise. But what's really interesting is that even with that law having been passed, my sense is that now Fidel is reemerging, despite that law having been passed. And I just want to show you this, and then I'll go back to that work. So I was actually at the Noche de las Antorchas in 2017, which is the first Noche de las Antorchas after Fidel died. Now, does everybody know, should I describe the Noche de las Antorchas?
Yes.
Okay, so in 1953, which was the centennial of Martí's birth, one of the first sort of major public acts that Fidel and Raúl Castro did to found the Juventud del Centenario that leads into the Cuban Revolution was they, on January 27th, which is like the night before the centennial, towards midnight, they took torches and they walked from the University of Havana to the stone quarry where Martí worked, as an adolescent, to pay tribute to Martí, right? And they are carrying the torch. They are the torch bearers, carrying forward the legacy of Martí, right? Which is the whole point of the early days of the revolution, right? So under the Cuban Revolution, this became obligatory. you are now, if you're a student at the University of Havana, your grades will suffer if you don't participate in this activity. So it's kind of crazy because you have literally 10,000 people with lighted torches in the street, but they're sort of there against their will. It was a really weird evening for me because I had just been in Washington, D.C. protesting the inauguration of Donald Trump. And so then I was in this other, ersatz protest that's required activity for university students. It was very strange. But obviously you can have fun doing this. Whatever your political beliefs, it's sort of fun and, but what happened that night had never happened before, but it was kind of like, now we can take the mask off, now we can say what we're really doing and who we're really celebrating. Let me see if I can just, is this hooked up? No. So the whole Noche de las Antorchas, which was about paying tribute to Martí and blah, 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 completely about Fidel. Completely about Fidel. So, and that was the chant the whole time, Yo soy Fidel. So the sort of disguise of the sort of Martí disguise seemed to me at that moment to be slipping. And when I saw that sign, Una sola revolución, that was kind of slipping too. So we seem to be getting far away from my original question, but I want to go back to this, which is a work of art. I hope you can see it. It's basically just an empty glass box. And it's titled Héroe, which of course is the word associated with Martí, right? El Héroe Nacional. You think of héroe in the Cuban context, you think of El Héroe Nacional, José Martí. And it's just transparent and empty. And through it, the way that the curators were brilliant, this is an exhibit that was part of the Bienal in the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes. You see through it, and here you have all these iconic photos of Fidel from the revolution. And then through it there, you actually have a self-portrait by Toirac, where he's disguised as Fidel at the top of the Pico Turquino, but he claims that it's a portrait of himself, not of Fidel. So I think I read this to mean, in this context, that Martí is just devoid of meaning at this point, that he's just been emptied out, that there's nothing there. He's just a transparent thing to look through and see the reality of what he's really being used to represent, which is Fidel Castro. But of course, if I saw that in a museum in New York, I would think, well, this means that Martí is invisible, that his presence hasn't yet been acknowledged, that he's not yet really here. So again, what it would mean, this work of art would change a great deal, depending on where it was exhibited. What would it mean in Tampa? I'm not sure. Maybe you guys will have some ideas about that. So I'm coming to the end of this, but I just want to, and this is just, I'm sure you guys, did you guys know about this story? This Martí, the great champion of freedom of speech, who of course ends up in New York because that's where he can have freedom of speech. And writing in a different language helped for having freedom of speech because nobody was really looking at what he wrote that much. But so not necessarily that freedom of speech was so much better, but just being in a different language that nobody could read, the police couldn't read, gave a lot of freedom. So this is a young director who made a movie called Quiero hacer una película, and in it there's a couple of young Cubans who speak ill of José Martí. And it's clearly that they're speaking ill of Martí because they understand him to be the face of the revolution. They're speaking ill of Martí as a way of saying, this is bullshit, right? And the film was not allowed to be shown because these two young people, one of them says, Martí was a maricón, right? He's just being like a naughty adolescent, right? It wasn't allowed to be shown, and the director was like, no, I love Martí, I even have La Rosa Blanca, but it didn't make any difference, and he was denounced. Here's the really interesting thing. He was denounced in a whole bunch of official speeches, and Raúl Castro actually made a speech that was published in Granma, where he defended Martí from all insult. He said, Martí, there is no freedom of speech where Martí is concerned, which is like, okay. And then, the most crazy thing is he compared him to Sucre, who's a Venezuelan general. Yeah. So again, this militarization of Martí, right? So, Carlos Riboll has that incredible thing about the falsification of Martí as a communist, but Martí has been falsified in so many different ways, right? Martí as Sucre was like this Venezuelan general. And yet,
Can I say something? Just
Yeah.
real quick, I have an old poster. That was a big propaganda thing in Cuba in the 70s. That Fidel had a famous speech where he says, Martí es el autor intelectual de la revolución. He's the intellectual author. And so there's these, statues that look like Big Brother sort of posters with Martí's visage. And underneath all it says is, autor intelectual, no? That's all you need to say. And it's like the revolution. Martí's the one who wrote the revolution. Martí's the intellectual author of the revolution.
right, which is with that poster that I showed earlier, una sola revolución, is just another way of reiterating that. Right, so it's not even an ideological stance, right? It doesn't even say was he or was he not communist as they tried to pretend early on. It's just Martí leads to Fidel, right? It's the same.
And why do they misquote the verses? It's not Martiga, it's Oruga. The original is Oruga, not Ortiga. I mean, everybody says Ortiga, but that's not what he wrote, and there's a good reason he put Oruga.
Well, there's many ways, as you know, in which his actual words have been distorted.
Right.
So let me just. But here's the other really interesting part of this question. As you guys know from listening to Lisandro's lecture, which I envy you not having been here to hear, one of the things everybody can agree on, which is a question that is not in any way difficult or fraught or complex, is that Martí was a New Yorker. If we take it down to the local level and we talk about that city, no one has any problem with it. Pedro Pablo Rodriguez, the head of the Centro de Estudios Martianos, has a chapter, Martí neoyorquino, in one of his books about Martí. So that's another really interesting thing. Why is it that on the local level, it's so easy, it's so acceptable to say he was a New Yorker, but once we get to higher national levels, it becomes so complicated, you know?
It seems to me, like through the course of this institute and listening today, that whether you're talking about Fidel, or you're talking about comparing him to Sucre, or you're talking about what we all individually find in Martí's works, or what Martí did, that through the prolific writing and through his life, you're able to connect with Martí in the way that you want, and then to make an argument for it. So I think you see that in like what's whether what Fidel might have looked for, or what we individually are looking for in Martí, or what New Yorkers look for in Martí, or whatever. There's an argument to be made that Martí can be the representative of what you want him to be.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about that Martí is so vast,
yeah.
that you can find in him, but that doesn't mean that you can't falsify him.
Right?
Right? Like, yes, meaning is ambiguous and rich, but that doesn't mean that people can't lie. Right? So I think that definitely people connect to him in different ways, and all of those ways are potentially legitimate, but there are also uses that he can be put to that are false.
As in anything.
Yes, as in anything else. But your point is really well taken. Martí, the New Yorker. But then we come to another question, a really fraught question. Is Martí a Latino? Very fraught question. This is, I don't know if you guys know this book by Felipe Fernandez Armesto. It purported to be a Latino history of the United States. It's called Our America, published in 2014. Now you might think that a book titled Our America, which is a Latino history of the United States, would have had a lot to say about José Martí, since obviously that title is a little bit familiar to all of us in this room. In fact, it barely mentions Martí. It alludes to him in like one sentence, but it includes this paragraph from the final passage of Nuestra America, but it leaves out the last sentence. So in the context of this book, anybody who read that paragraph and read the strong impetus of the single soul that the whole hemisphere shares, would think that Martí was calling for Pan-American unity. In other words, unity between the United States and Latin America. Anybody would think that. Of course, in the next sentence, he defines the part of the hemisphere that he's talking about as from the Rio Bravo to the Straits of Magellan, which makes it pretty clear what he's actually talking about, which is he's talking about Latin American unity. But And so, Felipe Fernández Armesto pulls Martí into an appeal for sort of Latino unity with the United States, in the United States, that has nothing to do with Martí's intentions in this essay, that has very little to do with Martí's intentions historically, with what he was doing in New York. So falsification can happen in many different ways, and I think that people who took their ideas about Martí from this book and this passage would say, oh, Martí was a sort of apostle of Latino unity with, U.S. Anglo culture, and said, oh, we're all just brothers, or something like that. Because if you read this without that final sentence, that's what you would think, right? So I think that there is a lot of misuse going on in lots of different ways. But there are some things I think we hope, and some things that I think are legitimate, fortunately, since this is my project, within this field. One is this wonderful book by, you met Emma. It's a children's book, and it's a bilingual children's book. And it's about Martí, and of course he's presented as a Cuban on the cover, but inside it has lots of beautiful pictures of him walking through the streets of New York, of him in the Catskills. And this is really only in the last 2 years that this book has come out. Emma is Cuban-American. Her parents are, but she grew up in New York, and so for her, Martí is a very important part of her past and her city, and so she's making that connection. I'm happy to say that this book did very well. And this I think is a wonderful way of overcoming some of those desencuentros that we've been talking about, and creating a space within the United States for this figure without damaging this figure in the process, the figure of Martí. And of course, as James knows, and as Anita knows, several of us, including Emma Otegui, by the way, who I work with, succeeded in inducting José Martí into the New York State Writers Hall of Fame. Most of the people at the judges of the New York State Writers Hall of Fame had never heard of Martí before. The person who gave the talk was Lisandro Perez, gave a beautiful tribute to Martí. And so, and I think that Martí himself might like being in this context among these writers. E.L. Collingsworth, of course, wrote children's literature, as did Martí. Colson Whitehead and Jacqueline Woodson are writers from minority communities within the United States who are dealing with that, like Martí. Russell Shorto wrote A History of New York. And Ira Gershwin was a songwriter, and of course, in his own way, as we know. So was Martí. So, this constellation of writers, I think, is really an interesting one for him to find himself in. I'm sorry to say that they just had a new inauguration of writers in New York City, and they didn't include anybody of Hispanic origin. And in the entire history since 2010, New York, of course, being the largest, at this point, demographically the largest Hispanic city in the United States, among the, I think now, like maybe 80 or 90 writers that they've inducted in the Hall of Fame, only 3 are Latino. Martí, Julia de Burgos, yes, and Miguel Piñero, who is the founder of the New York Poets Cafe.
That's insane.
But
That's
nobody
absurd.
else.
That's absurd. That's
And, I sent them, I was like, you guys really have a problem with Latino writers, you need to include more, and this year again, nobody's Latino. So, that's an argument for, Martí being included, and many more people like him being included. But I think what this says to us is that maybe the issue isn't redefining Martí, the issue is redefining the United States. And what we're really talking about is a phase in the redefinition of the history of the United States and the way in which the United States is coming to terms with its history in a whole different way. And maybe the introduction of Martí can be part of that process. It must be. So the final slide I'm going to share with you, I hope I haven't gone on too long. Oh my gosh, I said we would break it to 3:15, and it's 3:30, I apologize. Of course, Martí's induction into the New York State Writers Fame had exactly zero interest for anybody in the New York press or in the Anglophone press worldwide. There wasn't a single article about it. But in Cuba, and in Cuban, among Cuban exile communities, Diario de Cuba, everywhere, there were probably 6 or 7 articles about it. And one of the ones that I thought was really interesting is by Luis Toledo Sande, who of course is a biographer of Martí, has a biography. And I thought that he made an interesting observation, in that he was excited to see Martí recognized, but he also expressed a certain trepidation. Si no se ignora ni se soslean verdades tales y la iniciativa neoyorquina se asume con perspectiva ni colonizante ni colonizada, right? So again, the same, what surprised me is this the same kind of suspicion and fear that I've been expressing, Luis Toledo Sande expresses. And then what's really interesting is that he alludes to La Patria de Lincoln, which of course is the idea of Martí as an abolitionist, right? But how does he not become part of the history of abolition, which is so important for this country? How does that feature of his work, him as an abolitionist, not be brought up when we talk about him? How is he not part of that story of abolition and the abolition of slavery? And yet he isn't. So there's a possibility, I think, in that connection as well. Anyway, so I'm very sorry to have gone over so long. I didn't intend to keep you guys busy. So what I think we'll do is, everybody needs a little break, I think.
Yes.
And then I'm going to turn it over to you guys. I want to hear from you guys, these questions, these concerns that I've been expressing. So all of you have in front of you a handout, and there are 4 different basic